Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's panel discussion titled 75 Years of Partition, Rupture, and Connectivity. This panel kickstarts the ISAS International Conference in South Asia 2022, the Institute's annual flagship event. Before we proceed with the event, I would appreciate if you could mute your microphones and switch off your videos throughout the session. If you have any questions or feedback to share, please forward them via the chat box, and we will consolidate the questions for the panelists to answer during the Q&A time. Today, we are delighted to have with us the following distinguished panelists: Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, India's former Foreign Secretary and former National Security Advisor; Ambassador Maliha Lodi, former Ambassador of Pakistan to the United States, the UK, and the United Nations. We also have Ambassador Tariq Karim, former Bangladesh High Commissioner to New Delhi and Director, Center for Bay of Bengal Studies, Independent University, Bangladesh. Today's session will be chaired by Professor Tan Tai Yong, Professor of South Asian History, National University of Singapore. I now invite Associate Professor Iqbal Singh Savaya, Director of Institute of South Asian Studies, NUS, to deliver the opening remarks. Dr. Iqbal, please.
Thank you, Winnie. Good afternoon, distinguished chair, panelists, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, I thank you for joining us for this afternoon's panel discussion titled 75 Years of Partition, Rupture, and Connectivity. This panel discussion will kick off ISAS's annual International Conference on South Asia 2022. The annual conference on South Asia is our institute's flagship event. This year's conference commemorates the 75th anniversary of the partition of the Indian subcontinent and focuses on rupture and connectivity in the wake of the drawing of new political boundaries in 1947. South Asia is widely described as one of the least integrated regions in the world. There is a broad consensus on the need for greater economic, infrastructural, and people-to-people connections. There have also been serious attempts towards improving regional connectivity between Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, be it in the realms of enabling religious pilgrimages, sharing water resources, facilitating trade, or merging electricity grids. However, post-1947 geopolitical and ideological realities continue to impact the level of regional connectivity. It is important in this regard to view the partition not just as an event, but a process, and a long process at that, which has played out over time and given shape to specific modalities and norms of domestic statecraft, citizenship, regionalism, and foreign policy. It is worth noting here that interstate connectivity, or the lack of it, was an issue that was discussed and debated in the lead up to the partition itself. It is often neglected that there were multiple plans proposed in the 1940s for the political reorganization of the Indian subcontinent. While some foresaw the carving out of nation states, others called for the creation of federations. Yet others envisioned the creation of confederations. One such long forgotten proposal was that by Muhammad Shah Nawaz, and he was called the Confederacy of India Plan. Nawaz, who tellingly wrote under the pen name Punjabi, called for the formation of three large federations that were economically connected within a confederation of India. The merits or complexities of such a scheme aside, it reveals how in the lead up to the partition, there were concerns over the future economic cost of redrawing of boundaries, potential separation of raw materials such as jute in Dhaka from industries around Calcutta, and the human cost of migration or displacement. On a related note, a number of religious figures expressed concerns over the separation of communities from religious sites and pushed for the development of protocols to regulate pilgrimages. Thus, in the 75th year since the partition, it is timely to examine the impact that the drawing of new national boundaries had on existing linkages and institutions. This conference aims to do this by examining the following: the impact of the partition on institutions like the armed forces, bureaucracy, and police. Attempts to regulate mobilities, be it people, rivers, or finance. The emergence of new norms and structures of intra-state integration, the shaping of new forms of diplomacy and international relations, and the burgeoning of new arenas, protocols, and initiatives of interaction. It is equally important to examine the new modalities, mechanisms, structures, and norms that arose from 1947 onwards to regulate, restrict, or redefine relations between the new states and govern interstate relations. Over the next 3 days, we will have 6 roundtables with participation from globally based academics, researchers, and practitioners working in various disciplines. I have no doubt that this will provide us with in-depth perspectives on the long process of the partition and the geopolitics and geoeconomics of connectivity in contemporary South Asia. This afternoon's panel will provide an excellent foil to the discussions that will follow in the coming days. I'm grateful to Professor Tan Taeyong, Chairman of ICES, for kindly agreeing to chair the session. Given his scholarly contributions to the history and historiography of the partition, he's most apt for this task. I'm equally thankful to the panelists, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Ambassador Maliha Lodi, and Ambassador Tariq Karim, 3 highly distinguished experts for joining us this afternoon. Together, they will delve deep into the topic and share with us their invaluable insights. Like all of you, I look forward to hearing the views of the panelists, and I wish all of us an enriching session. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Iqbal. I now invite Prof. Tan to start the session. Prof. Tan, please.
Thank you, Winnie. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tan Taeyong, and I'm delighted to chair this first panel discussing the theme of the conference, 75 Years of Partition, Rupture and Connectivity, which will kickstart a series of roundtables over the next few days. This year, India and Pakistan will be celebrating their Diamond Jubilee, the 75th year of independence. The commemoration of independence in India and Pakistan also offers the occasion to remember partition, what we call the other face of independence. The births of India and Pakistan was accompanied by the monumental disruptions caused by partition, with all its long-term impact on the divergent political economies of both countries. In some ways, it led to another partition in 1971, the breakup of Pakistan, leading to the birth of Bangladesh. The ICES annual conference this year will address the salient theme of partition, but it will focus on the future and ask how the region can overcome the long-term and lingering effect of the partitions. This afternoon's panel will focus on 3 interrelated themes. The first is regional connectivity. The integrated transport networks and linked infrastructure that South Asia acquired from the British were initially shattered by the partition and then by its political aftermath and the Second Division in 1971. It is quite evident that in order to tackle challenges in enhancing regional connectivity, clear and specific priorities need to be established, and cooperation links at the national as well as international level need to be further strengthened. What needs to be done, and what are the possibilities here? The second theme looks at India-Pakistan tensions and the related challenges to connectivity. The onerous burden of South Asian history is evident in the continuing strained relations between Pakistan and India, which have been largely responsible for the inability of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, or SAARC, to address common challenges. Among others, India-Pakistan strained relations have also overshadowed the possibilities of collaboration on trade and economic connectivity between them. It is obvious that the peace dividend from economic engagement would be substantial, but what are the obstacles and challenges to achieving this? The third theme focuses on the SAARC and the challenges it faces in interstate cooperation. Since its inception in the late 1970s, SAARC has evolved slowly both in terms of institutions and economic integration. The vision of economic integration under SAARC appears to be a distant reality. Unhindered trade and commerce remain no more than just a pipe dream. But SAARC members have shown willingness to work together with one another on issue-based cooperation, which is shown in the responses to the COVID pandemic. But will SAARC evolve to a truly effective regional body that can work for the betterment of South Asia in the way that ASEAN is regarded in Southeast Asia? To address these 3 themes, we are delighted to have 3 distinguished speakers, each with many years of experience and illustrious service at the highest policy level, policymaking and diplomacy. The biodata of these speakers have been circulated earlier, and I will not take time reading them out. I will introduce them briefly as I invite them to deliver their presentations. They will each speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and after their presentations, time collectively for a Q&A session. So without further ado, let me first invite Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at ISS NUS, India's former Foreign Secretary and India's former National Security Advisor, to make his presentation. Ambassador Shankar, please.
Thank you, Professor Thantayong. And it's good to be back among friends, even virtually, to talk and learn about 75 years of partition at ISAS's annual conference. And thank you very much for asking me to speak. It's hard to think of another sub-region on Earth which has seen its internal and external borders change more often than the Indian subcontinent. Perhaps Europe is the closest example. Borders in other inhabited sub-regions, East Asia, Africa, Latin America, were relatively stable for centuries in early modern times. But the subcontinent has exhibited a fluidity in political arrangements and borders, which translated into the repeated redrawing of boundaries. I don't have to tell an audience like this. I mean, since the 19th century alone, we've seen the addition to British India, Burma, its separation, 1905 partition of Bengal, its rollback, repartition in 1947, independence of Bangladesh. I mean, India itself has been redrawing internal boundaries from 1947 onwards. And Pakistan has gone from several provinces to single unit, etc., etc. Why are there such frequent partitions? Boundary making and othering in South Asia was partly a consequence of the process of creating Westphalian states and introducing modernity in the subcontinent. And in practice, it meant a series of administrative measures to make people, communities, the land and its resources legible and taxable by the state, making them subject to the monopoly of violence and claims to exclusive sovereignty, and hard linear boundaries that define the modern state. And with the formation and consolidation of centralizing states and the rise of nationalism in the 19th century, frontiers became the critical sites where processes of integration played out in administration, in culture, in ecology, and so on. And national movements in South Asia, which arose as a reaction to colonial rule, drew on Western exemplars, particularly the perfervid nationalism associated with the nation state in late 19th and early 20th century Europe, rather than on earlier local traditions, and reinforced the trend to partitions. Many partitions were thus attempts to facilitate rule and access to resources by the state, or the product of rising nationalisms and local patriotism, but clearly not all of them delivered what they promised. And the constant recourse to more partitions suggests a continuing tension between state-driven making of boundaries, internal and external, and a much more complex reality than these plans provided for. Even today, imperial lines named after their drafters, Durand, McMahon, Radcliffe, still contested and cause us trouble to this day as sources of conflict. Borderland communities, people, languages, and cultures existed long before most 21st century states. The UN and other international institutions are all much later phenomenon. And it can be argued convincingly, I think, that both the colonial state and its successors had to keep chopping and changing wherever these partitions went against the grain of demography, communities, local custom, geography, the land, the economy, and the lived experience of people. And therefore, they required constant tinkering. But the consequence of this situation include cross-border ethnicities across all our borders, artificial boundaries, economic disruption, and the alienation of traditional communities whose attachment to their traditional customs became difficult with hard boundaries. I think Professor Than's book on the aftermath of partition in South Asia is really a remarkably prescient look at the broader impact of the 47 partition. A more recent example of what I'm talking about is when the military coup in Myanmar in 2021 drove many Chin across the international boundary into Mizoram. When Delhi tried to close the border, the state government, local population refused to do so against their cross-border cousins, fellow tribespeople with whom they have intermarried, lived, and worked together for centuries. And in practice, the border stayed open. So this unending process of bordering and othering in South Asia has resulted also in the securitization of the borderlands and an obsession of the states with security and border management, and has several impacts beyond the sheer human toll. State capacity to perform basic functions too is affected. Partitions that go against the grain of demography, geography, etc., diminish initiative at the local level, promote dissatisfaction, which could lead to radicalization and violence, and even ultimately to separatist movements, and create opportunities for rent-seeking behavior, with a real risk of criminalization of state and law enforcement agencies. So connectivity is often suggested as a solution to these issues. Making boundaries irrelevant is certainly one way of ameliorating the negative economic, psychological, and other effects of serial partitions. And the fact is that the subcontinent is today much better connected than it was 2 decades ago. A great deal has been accomplished in this period in terms of improved connectivity between most countries in the subcontinent, and the benefits of these connections have become apparent. To take one example, over the last decade and a half, India and Bangladesh have done a great deal to improve connectivity in terms of power grid connections, the use of inland waterways, border hearts, coastal shipping, other steps, which have direct impact on the lives of people in both countries. But these were predicated on a fundamental mutual understanding on security, namely not to permit one soil to be used by elements antagonistic to the other, and by the elimination of the uncertainty associated with enclaves, with undetermined portions of the land border, and by the settlement of the maritime boundary in the same period. Today, we have a situation where South Asia is in flux. Several states face political crises superimposed on grim economic situations. 5 South Asian governments changed recently. 3 governments are in talks with the IMF for solutions to debt crises, and a 4th is seeking a Chinese loan. In this situation, physical connectivity alone is not enough. We live in an age of nationalism and nation states, and we cannot separate the security and connectivity agendas if we are to succeed in either. Geostrategy and geopolitics are facts of life in the subcontinent that any attempt to reconnect the subcontinent must take into account. We also need to ensure that our states create the right environment for the subcontinent to be reconnected. And this is unfortunately not something supported naturally by domestic politics in our countries, which has become more divisive and polarized in this decade. As states and polities become more securitized, being out of power is no longer an option for leaders, and subcontinental issues are used for domestic political purposes and mobilization, making rational connectivity more difficult. This perhaps shouldn't surprise us. After all, nothing in our experience suggests that states are solely motivated by altruistic motives. But to my mind, the way forward is only by understanding, recognizing, and dealing with the complex reality that is South Asia, that we can hope to overcome the negative impacts of partitions using connectivity and using the opportunities that modern technology give us, because actually connectivity, technology, etc., provide us with the means to overcome these negative impacts of partition. And that is why, in my opinion, meetings like this are so important, bringing together people and scholars from across the subcontinent and from around the world to discuss this topic. So thank you very much. I think I've stopped in my 10 minutes.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Yes, I think you kept very good time. Thank you very much. I know there'll be many questions for Ambassador Menon, but I'm going to hold all questions until we've heard from all 3 presenters. So I'm now like to invite Ambassador Malia Lodi, former ambassador of Pakistan to the United States, the United Kingdom, and the United Nations, to deliver her presentation. Ambassador Lodi, please.
Thank you very much. And I also want to thank your very prestigious institution for inviting me. And I'm delighted to be amongst such distinguished co-panelists. So let me start on an upbeat note and then perhaps get to a reality check. So, I want to start by saying that Asia's transformed economic dynamics have created a historical and transformational moment, which of course urges the need for greater economic connectivity. Asia, as we all know, is already the global center of manufacturing. By 2050, it'll account for half the world's GDP and will be in a dominant economic position with an even larger footprint on the global economy. But as we all know, South Asia is the least integrated region in the world. Now, this is both a challenge and an opportunity, as Ambassador Menon also pointed out. Asia, as I said before, accounts for half the world's manufacturing output. It hosts a large youthful population that offers a demographic opportunity. But the barriers to greater regional integration and cooperation obviously have to be overcome. The region is beset by long-standing disputes, imposing internal political and economic challenges, as well as social conflicts. A new South Asia paradigm needs a new way of thinking and conducting regional business at both the level of governments and the level of the public. It also needs a new narrative, so people see the value of regional connectivity and embrace it to become part of a strategic effort aimed at overcoming the hurdles imposed by the past. Now, we know that the onerous burden of history is evident in the continuing strained and tense relations between Pakistan and India. This is, of course, principally responsible for SAARC's failure to realize the promise it holds of regional cooperation to address shared challenges. Established in 1985 to promote economic and regional integration, it launched the South Asia Free Trade Area in 2004, which became operational in 2006. But its aim to create a regional economic union proved to be elusive. This is not surprising because the region is afflicted by unresolved disputes, as I pointed out earlier, border tensions, geopolitical rivalries, and of course, security dilemmas that need to be addressed. Even as South Asian countries, big and small, want to make economic progress and connectivity their priority. Now, the bitterness, animosity, and legacy of partition, or the wounds of partition, shaped the course of turbulent relations between Pakistan and India. The rupture 75 years ago was so severe as to leave the new state of Pakistan with little institutional infrastructure. While India inherited a proper bureaucratic apparatus, Pakistan had to build one in 1947 in the middle of chaos, and where there was a state of emergency with refugees pouring in from India. Pakistan also had to build its industrial and manufacturing capacity from virtually scratch, as much of what became of Pakistan had a largely agrarian economy. So both the civilian bureaucracy and the military were handicapped by a shortage of manpower. The inequitable sharing of colonial assets and the territorial map drawn by the departing colonial power imbued official thinking in my country with a sense of injustice that Pakistan got an unfair deal. For example, the country's founder, Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, twice rejected the territorial contours of Pakistan as it emerged, describing them as, quote, mutilated, truncated, and moth-eaten, unquote. So Pakistan's sense of insecurity was heightened by the persistent questioning in the early years by the Indian leadership of Pakistan's rationale and viability, and view of the country as an unfortunate but temporary breach of the subcontinent's strategic unity. Pakistan's fear of Indian hostility and domination was reinforced by Delhi's conduct during and after partition. The forcible incorporation of several Muslim-majority princely states into the Indian Union, and above all, Kashmir, engendered deep mistrust and suspicion. In fact, mutual antagonism crystallized into the early conflict over Kashmir, the centerpiece of the unfinished business of partition. The conflict over Kashmir also reflected Pakistan's anxiety about the equitable sharing of waters of the Indus Basin. It was not until 1960 that the World Bank brokered Indus Waters Treaty was signed. But then disputes over building water projects continued, as have intermittent negotiations to resolve them. So really, early hostilities with India and the preoccupation with order in the initial chaotic days following independence gave the military in Pakistan prominence and subsequently ascendancy over the political system. Later, this asymmetry between non-elected and elected institutions was to be consequential for the country's political evolution, an account for repeated military interventions in politics and long bouts of military rule. Of course, extra-regional powers had an important role to play in the Pakistan-India equation. In the Cold War years, Pakistan's strategic partnership with the United States, a reflection of its external balancing strategy to counter India's dominant position, was matched by Delhi's alignment with the then Soviet Union. These relationships were born of each country's strategic compulsions. But what they did was to drive the region into the vortex of superpower Cold War rivalry. Superpower involvement unleashed its own dynamics and in fact magnified India-Pakistan tensions and rivalry. The two countries fought 3 wars, 2 over Kashmir, while the third culminated in the breakup, the disintegration of Pakistan. 1971, in fact, marked a massive failure in building Pakistan into a cohesive nation, largely as a consequence of the ruling elite's resistance to accommodate Bengali aspirations. But it also confirmed Pakistan's worst fears about India, that it sought to weaken and to dismember Pakistan. Perhaps the most promising period of normalization of relations through an India-Pakistan peace process was under President Pervez Musharraf and Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee. This began in earnest in 2004, carrying forward what was called the Composite or Integrated Dialogue agreed earlier in 1997. This was predicated on 8 baskets of issues which covered the entire gamut of disputes and issues of interest between the two countries and included those of priority for each side. It comprised very quickly peace and security, including CBMs, Kashmir, Siachen, Sir Creek, Wooler Barrage, and other navigation projects, economic and commercial cooperation, terrorism and drug trafficking, and promotion of friendly exchanges. Now, without going into detail of its various rounds, and I know that Ambassador Menon has intimate knowledge of this, what I would like to say is that this process perhaps saw the most substantive exchanges on trade and economic cooperation. Discussions between the Commerce Secretaries on border and transit trade made significant progress, despite many bottlenecks. And trade did increase, albeit modestly, between the two neighbors. But the potential and promise of this wide-ranging peace process, which took place in fits and starts, was unfortunately never realized. And the most ambitious mutual effort to reach a negotiated settlement on Kashmir in 2007, the so-called 4-point formula, actually represent an extraordinarily missed opportunity. Now, if I fast forward to the present state of play, formal dialogue has been suspended for the past several years by India. Diplomatic representation was downgraded and trade suspended by Pakistan in 2019. This followed India's revocation of Article 370 of its constitution that gave Kashmir special status and its incorporation in the Indian Union, which Pakistan argued was in total violation of UN Security Council resolution. Now, the acknowledgement by both countries, and I think this acknowledgement has been verbalized many times, perhaps not recently though, that they have much to gain from trade and connectivity in economic areas, has, however, taken a backseat to the revival of tensions and the shadow of unresolved disputes and geopolitical considerations by both countries. Pakistan's vision of regional connectivity is now centered on CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is the pivot of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the 21st century's most ambitious economic enterprise. This envisages enhancing Pakistan's connectivity, accelerating its economic progress, and expanding and modernizing its road, rail, energy, and transportation systems. Several hydel energy and transport infrastructure projects have already been completed. Many are under construction. So really, the economic corridor is at the heart of two key aspects of China's Silk Road vision: maritime and land links. Now, in addition to north-south connectivity, Pakistan has also actively promoted energy corridor projects such as TAPI, gas pipeline, and CASA 1000, which aim to address the energy needs of the region and generate economic activity in Afghanistan. The World Bank-supported CASA 1000 is a power transmission project that envisages the export of seasonal hydropower generated in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan to Pakistan and Afghanistan. TAPI, or the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipelines, is quite a mouthful, aims to be a trans-country natural gas pipeline running across 4 countries. It's also known as the Peace Pipeline. Now, this is conceived to begin in Turkmenistan and cross Afghanistan to enter Pakistan and then India. But of course, these projects are also dependent partly on the Taliban's attitude in Afghanistan and its conduct, as well as, of course, more substantively perhaps on the state of relations between Pakistan and India. Now, in its national security strategy announced earlier this year, Pakistan clearly stated its objective to shift its foreign policy emphasis to geoeconomics from geopolitics. It set out a vision of becoming a regional economic hub by leveraging the country's location at the intersection of South, Southwest, and Central Asia. This places Pakistan at the epicenter, in its view, of an arc of economic opportunity. So its vision rests on enhancing connectivity with the 3 regions of which it is a part. But clearly, the achievement of this vision would be incomplete without peace with India, which would enable East-West connectivity. So, and I'll wrap up soon, if India and Pakistan were to settle their outstanding disputes, I believe practical issues relating to trade and connectivity should also not be difficult to resolve. The peace dividend from economic engagement would be significant, if not substantial. There are many common challenges, including energy, that would benefit from cooperation. So let me conclude where I began, on an upbeat note. Global and regional challenges and transformations offer extraordinary opportunities to promote a new strategic paradigm in South Asia that sees regionalism and connectivity as a force multiplier and accords primacy to economic cooperation over strategic differences and managing competitive relationships in a way that is constructive and stabilizing. Such a new South Asia paradigm would serve the interests of the peoples of Pakistan, India, and other regional states, as well as the larger Asian community. It would transform South and Southwest Asia from an area of instability and an arc of tensions into perhaps the newest Asian economic miracle. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lodi. I would now like to invite Ambassador Tariq Karim, former Bangladesh High Commissioner to New Delhi, Director, Center for Bay of Bengal Studies, Independent University, Bangladesh, to make his presentation. Ambassador Karim, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. First of all, I wish to thank the ISAS and Dr. Iqbal Singh and everyone there for inviting me to share this platform with this very distinguished colleagues from India and Pakistan and speak on an issue which has bedeviled our region for 75 years, depends on where we are looking at it from. Professor Iqbal Singh Sevia, Director, Professor Tantai Young, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, Ambassador Mulia Lodi, with whom both of whom I have had the privilege of serving together for short periods or being together in the same place. Now, as has been mentioned, the partition of the historical civilizational subcontinent known as the Indian subcontinent in 1947 was followed by another partition in 1971. But I think the initial partition was not so much a partition of India as it was a partition of Bengal and Punjab, the two major provinces that drove the Indian economy and dynamics before the partition. And that led to a series of sub-partitions within the new states formed, and also domestically within India, we've seen several partitions along different lines. It overnight transforms the most integrated region in the world into the least integrated. The biggest harm, in my personal opinion, is it partitioned our mindsets, how we look at each other, how we will behave with each other, how we will react to each other. Our perceptions of each other were also partitioned, as well as historical legacies of shared geospaces and ecosystems. That, I think, the partitioning, one can do partitioning on the land, but how do you partition the commons and the ecospaces? They do not follow Westphalian norms and rules and we always to read to the partition, making half-hearted. We deliberately drew hard new Westphalian borders, not only across lands that we had inhabited for eons in a shared manner, but more damagingly inside our minds and psyches that share our attitudes, interlocutions, perceptions of the new other that we had constructed in the post-colonial disorder that we emerged into. We abandoned our previous legacy and practice of integration and rendered the fabric of a previously integrated social order, or at least that existed, I would say, pre-30s, which were torn and tattered beyond repair. Now, what effect did it have? How did it unfold on the way we then conducted, how we built our states, and how we built the systems through which we interacted with each other? Essentially, immediately after partition, and for some time after that, the structures, the infrastructure, the rules, regulations of the British colonial era were the same, but sharp differences emerged in their application and interpretation, heavily colored progressively by the partition syndrome that we had penned ourselves in. In the initial years, while still dominated and even led by British personnel at the highest levels of certainly the armed forces, but even of the civil administration, the training and legacies were essentially the same. This still managed some degree of rapport at personal levels, rooted by comradeship in the same training institutes, but the progressive dilution of those trainings was inevitable, as each segment of the fractured entity progressively, with somewhat varying degrees of intensity, inculcated ever deeper sense of highlighting the different narratives of separateness that the national objectives of each required. In Pakistan, and perhaps even in India, the focus on national integration among the different segments that comprise the total fabric of the new nation state was also sought to be deepened by emphasizing the differences between themselves and the newly created other. Perhaps largely fueled by fears of the new ruling elites in each partition segment losing their newfound role, interlocution, exchanges, and even meetings at personal levels were progressively discouraged or even forbidden, largely because the new respective ruling elites feared losing their own newfound preeminence and dominance in the new social order that each newly carved nation state that emerged 1947 increasingly sought to create and emphasize. This resulted in deepening the divide and broadening the chasm, of hardening the borders and making them progressively impermeable. The most devastating draconian measure was the dropping of the virtual Iron Curtain around the borders of the then East Pakistan, along the borders of, along with India. And this brought to a complete halt all forms of communication by riverine routes, steamer ship communication that had existed for hundreds of years, railways, and the rudimentary roads that everyone had inherited from the British period. Railway links at the newly defined Westphalian borders were progressively physically severed, uprooted, and paved over, heavily guarded by paramilitary personnel on both sides, or stopped outright, and number of road communications were drastically reduced. The effect of closing inland water routes had an incalculably disastrous effect on the ecology of the rivers. As you all know, perhaps, Bangladesh is heavily dominated by its waterscape. It's a deltaic land, and all our rivers flow from upstreams and drain into the Bay of Bengal. And this is something that we had relied upon, not just for agriculture, for our livelihood. People are they're born on the rivers and they die in the rivers. This continuing, when the ships operated transboundary, the steamship companies, the river steamship companies, which were jointly owned in most cases, actually dredged the rivers every year. When we started a war, process stopped. And because the billions of tons of silt carries down from the Himalayas, they started changing the geomorphology of the rivers and rendering them highly damaged. The emergence of new norms and structures of interstate integration soon after partition, the leaders on opposite sides of the newly carved Westphalian entities realized, somewhat foggily perhaps, that the sudden cessation of all person-to-person interactions and trade needed to be resumed in everyone's interest. That actually led to ultimately the setting up of SAARC, a move that was initiated and spearheaded and driven first by Bangladesh and with others joining it. However, the progressively hardening attitudes towards the counterparts with the new respective national security apparatus always tended to upend any serious attempts to restore some iota of pre-partition communication or interlocution between peoples and allowing exchange of goods and services. The institutions inherited were the same essentially, but the goals had now become different. Previous colleagues looked at each other as enemies or antagonists, the goals of each increasingly inimical to the other. Essentially, this was a process that dominated the India-Pakistan relations and attitudes to each other, but did not spare East Pakistan, which later became Bangladesh. Bilateral hostilities spilled over into the international interlocutions increasingly. As strains developed internally and progressively, almost from immediately after partition between East Pakistanis and West Pakistanis, the complex post-partition relationship became increasingly more complicated. The logical progression of this complex relationship was resolved, at least for some time, following the separation of East Pakistan from West Pakistan, following a 9-month-long bloody war. India's diplomatic, economic, and political and military help to the Bengalis of East Pakistan was of critical importance for the end result. However, the dictates of neo-nationalism in the newly emerged third sovereign country in the same geopolitical space within less than a quarter century also evolved into a progressively complex love-hate relationship developing between all three legatees of the past. The return to power of the Awami League government in Bangladesh in 1996, almost after 18 years in the political wilderness, brought in some modicum of pragmatism and a fresh approach to viewing how relations between the two inevitable neighbors should be approached and governed. At the starting point, Bangladesh and India signed a 30-year treaty of sharing the Ganges water, and this turned into both sides acknowledging the need to end all cross-border insurgencies. During the first term of Awami League government led by Sheikh Hasina, the first post-partition business summit led by the respective prime ministers of Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan met together to review the state of moribund economic and commercial interactions. Cooperation with the newly established Indian Ocean Ring Association also showed some glimmer of all three meeting on common ground, but these hopes were short-lived. When the Awami League government of 1996 was defeated by the BLP, the process was disrupted and even reversed, replaced by polarization stoked deliberately across communal lines. As a real fresh breakthrough came with the re-election of the Awami League led by Sheikh Hasina in December 2008, with a considerably large and serious mandate for improvement of relations as well as undertaking reforms. The long festering land boundary dispute between India and Bangladesh was resolved. The maritime boundary disputes between Bangladesh and India and Bangladesh and Myanmar were resolved, as a result of which the Bay of Bengal perhaps is one of the rare water bodies in the oceanic world that we inhabit that is tension-free on charges of on account of water disputes. Direct maritime links and coastal shipping arrangements that had pre-existed partition were restored in 2015. Most railway connectivity that had existed between Bangladesh and India prior to 1947 or 1965, and some identified waterway connectivity routes have been gradually restored. Bangladesh has positioned itself as a bridging state, a gateway facilitating trade and connectivity between the entities west and east of it. There are several ports, Mongla, Chittagong, Paira, and now the deep sea port coming up at the Matarbari will truly be game-changing. I'll stop there because this leads to several dynamics, and I hope questions in the Q&A we will have time to address in greater detail some of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tariq. So we've heard three excellent presentations, and that leaves us for about maybe 40 minutes for a round of the Q&A for all three panelists. I've already seen questions on the chat box. I think the first couple were addressed to Ambassador Lodi, and she's addressed the question by giving an answer there. But just maybe you want to elaborate on this question about why did Pakistan not reciprocate the most favored nation status when India offered it to Pakistan? And I think you've explained it in the chat box, but maybe I'd like to invite Ambassador Lodi just to elaborate on her reply. Thank you. Ambassador Lodi, please. Yeah.
Thank you. I think you can hear me, right?
Yes.
All right. You know, Pakistan's perspective was, when this was taking place, it made 2 or 3 points. I'll just repeat those. One, that India had a more restrictive trade regime, a more controlled trade regime than Pakistan. Pakistan is much more open trade regime. And therefore, the need to have an even playing field for this MFN and for trade to really proceed. The second point Pakistan made was, of course, it's a subset of the first one, which is that India's agriculture receives a lot of subsidies. And again, that creates an uneven playing field. Thirdly, I think we confronted, when trade was proceeding, we confronted non-tariff barriers imposed by India on our goods that were being exported to India. So I think there was a whole bunch of issues that needed to be resolved. The question was not that we were against an MFN. Of course, it has political, there is a political connotation to this, because it can only come about when relations between the two countries have reached a certain point of détente. It can't happen when relations are tense. But even when relations were, let's say, improving, these were some of the issues that needed to be resolved, and they still, they remain unresolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Lodi. Now, I have two questions here that may be addressed to Ambassador Menon. And I think in relation to the point that you made earlier in your presentation about how geopolitics and security are predominant paradigms in regional relations, notwithstanding the desire for connectivity. So the one question is about how South Asian region has great economic potential, much greater than Europe, but India and Pakistan continues to stump this sort of relationship because of strained relations. And the question is, how would sanity prevail in India and Pakistan, and how do you get these two countries to work together? And a second related question is basically about relations as well. How can connectivity be established if issues are not being negotiated, like Kashmir and militarism, arms race, etc., that continue to plague the region? So maybe I'll invite Ambassador Menon to address this first, and then I'll invite the other two speakers to come in later on. Ambassador Menon, please.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make actually is, I don't think fundamentally very different from what Ambassador Lodi is saying, but you need to address the politics, that we can't just take a purely economic view of connectivity, say, look, it's in our interest, so we'll do it. With the best will in the world, we haven't managed. Where we have done well in connectivity between India and Bangladesh in the last 15 years, for instance, is where we dealt with both. We dealt with the political issues and we dealt with the economic issues. Now, that I'm not a pessimist here, actually. I actually think the political issues can be dealt with. And as Ambassador Lodi said, we came very close between 2004, 2007. I think domestic politics and terrorism actually stopped it and stopped it in its tracks. And that is exactly what I'm saying. We need to deal with those issues if we are to have a successful connectivity strategy among ourselves. So we're not saying different things. So how do we deal with these issues is, I think, the question that's being asked. I mean, I have said now for almost 10 years that I think SAARC needs to look at more than just social, economic, and that we need to start seeing whether we can't do something about our own security, about our political issues as well. This idea that somehow we won't bring our bilateral political issues to SAARC, by not bringing it, we've actually killed SAARC. So maybe we need a forum where we can talk about it in a non-binding way, where we at least look at our common interests and see what we can do in these areas. But if that is too much, and that might be maybe too much for most of our governments to swallow, because their fear of the unknown is really quite high. It seems to me, therefore, let's look at the successful times when we did address these issues, including difficult issues like peace and security, terrorism, cross-border terrorism, Kashmir, etc. And let's learn from what we did in the past. So I actually think it's possible. Now, the interesting thing is that, like everything else, like our economies in South Asia, much of what we do is informal. It doesn't fit into traditional theory, state-to-state relations. We've had a ceasefire on the India-Pakistan LOC, which has held now for over a year. Why? Because it suits both of us right now. We have other things to worry about. It held from 2003 November for an extended period, for several years actually. Again, because we are clever enough to understand our interests. But unfortunately, it seems to serve the political interest of certain ruling elites, and I'm not saying only in one country or the other, to have a managed level of hostility in some of these relationships. And that, for me, is the worrying part. That's something we have to address within our own countries. Each of us has to take care of it ourselves. We can't fiddle in each other's internal politics. That's beyond us. But we need to address that issue. So what I'm trying to say is not that this is impossible. I'm saying, please look at it as an integrated whole. Look at connectivity as part of the solution, but in order to make that solution possible, look at the successful examples. India, Bangladesh, look at India, Pakistan, 2004-07, Look at there are several other examples with Sri Lanka, for instance, etc. And choose your methods and find ways of doing it. So actually, I am a bit of an optimist here. The risk is if we go around touting our victimhood and mentioning all our grievances from the past, we are very clever also at constructing narratives of our own history and of how badly we've been treated. And each of us will tell ourselves this story. And frankly, I see this increasing, this victimhood narrative taking hold in more and more parts of the subcontinent. If we do that, then I'm afraid we are lost. And it's very important, as Tariq said, what we think, how we think, and how we actually frame these issues to our own people and to each other and within ourselves, within those who think about these issues. So, and somebody has mentioned, what about the turmoil, the political turmoil, the debt crisis that countries are facing? For me, a crisis is an opportunity. Here's a time when, frankly, we should be setting up our own payments arrangements among ourselves. Now is the time for all of us in the subcontinent to say, okay, you know, our currencies have depreciated terribly against the dollar. We'll settle among ourselves. We'll find our own payment arrangements, which we will set up. I mean, India has now spent about $3.8 billion in terms of food, fuel, credit to Sri Lanka, because frankly, the world is taking its own time in solving their debt default and debt crisis. But it seems to me it's logical for South Asia at this time use the crisis as an opportunity to create new structures, to look at new ways of doing business among ourselves and build the connectivity. I can go on and on, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Ambassador Menon. Ambassador Lodi, do you have anything to add to that?
I'll just say a couple of things. I won't take very long. I agree with Ambassador Menon, of course, that we need to address the politics before we address anything else. And that applies as much to politics within our countries, as India is going through a certain transformation, which is not exactly very positive, and it has a very distinct anti-Muslim dimension. Islamophobia is not just on the rise, but we're seeing very, very violent expressions of it. And of course, we need to also address the politics of the relationship between the two countries. But two examples I'd like to cite where, Ambassador Menon says, even at the worst of times, there were certain things that were still happening. I think one of the things that has happened despite the rocky relationship between the two countries is the fact that every January, the two countries have exchanged lists of their respective nuclear installations. Now, that's a very important measure that the two countries take every year. And in that regard, I think I would mention that, the peace process that Ambassador Menon is also mentioning and I spoke about in some detail, it worked because it was called the integrated or the composite dialogue for that very reason, because it had a whole series of issues that needed to be addressed, not just economics, but security, politics, CBMs. And in that regard, I will mention that the kind of confidence building measures that were agreed between the two countries, and some of them still hold, in the nuclear and conventional realm were important. For example, advance notice of testing of missile tests. This still takes place. At times there are complaints by one or the other country that you didn't really let us know, because you're supposed to notify the other country if it's within the range, a certain range which is specified. Now, if we can make those things work better, and at the same time, sort of rise above some of the hostilities of the past, I agree. We must learn from the past and not live in the past. Then we can move forward. But certainly, I think there is a willingness in Pakistan, as we confront so many internal challenges, to really have peace on our borders so that we can focus on these internal challenges. So there is a strategic compulsion now. And I think the government in Delhi, if it was to sort of acknowledge and recognize that there is an opportunity. Now, that doesn't mean we're going to be able to resolve our problems overnight, but it just means that there is a readiness on the part of both the civilian elected government and Pakistan's military to take steps so that we have peace on our borders. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Tariq, do you want to?
Yes, I'll just pick up on the point that economics and politics are inextricably intertwined. Each affects the others. We cannot ignore that. We cannot enter into a framework of economic cooperation which ignores the politics. After all of us are democratic states in different stages of imperfection. Let me put it that way. Each democracy is a project and process, and we develop it as our own people allow it to develop. In this, when we decided to, when we understood and decided that we need to have better relations with India. Why? Because it once again restores the process by which we interacted. Not only that, I think recently Bangladesh has been cited by many. It is the fastest growing economy, not just in the region, but also globally. Why? How was it able to transform itself from the basket case that it was written off as contemptuously in 72 to now being looked upon with degrees of admiration, some criticism, but yes, largely that we managed to turn ourselves around into something that nobody predicted we could come into. And I would attribute it that largely because we restored connectivity and started moving eastward, restoring it with the Northeast India, looking to the east, trying to restore it with Southeast and East Asia. This is where our historical legacy was always. We must not forget that Bengal was the richest presidency of the three presidencies through which the British ruled colonial India. It had the largest GDP and it had the highest per capita GDP. Why did we lose it? Simply, I attributed, at least in my mind, that when we partitioned not just it was an integrated, ecologically integrated and economically integrated unit. We partitioned that, we severed the connection. We stopped interacting with each other. If you're going to sell your goods to somebody else, the other person must be able to examine your goods, determine whether it's befitting the price you're going to get, and a lot of other things. When that stops, then basically you are just touting slogans and rhetoric, but you're not enabling it to happen. The restoration of connectivity is the enabler. And we have always been an enabler to some extent from what we produced and sent out to the world, but largely because we allowed this passage between West and East. That we understand is our future. That is the only way that we can go forward. When we looked on SAARC as, well, basically three sub-regions, why should one hold up the others? So when we embarked on BBIN, it was to say, okay, this is the least problematic. Can we fix BBIN in a manner that it will attract others to say, can we join in this? So I would hope that the process that we started in the eastern part of South Asia will affect the others. I see some signs of the southern part of South Asia joining in, and I hope the western part of South Asia will also. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tariq. Now, the next cluster of questions concern great power involvement in the region. There was one question specifically about US-Pakistan military alliance, and this is more historical. How has that alliance, in a way, consolidated certain divisions between India and Pakistan, and promoted militarism and that sort of thing? And then one that's ongoing is, of course, the involvement of great powers and major powers like Iran, Saudi Arabia, alliances, bloc politics. And then there's one question that's related to the BRI, whether that, in a way, could be used to enhance connectivity. But of course, this one involves China. So this cluster of questions is about powers and how they play a role in enhancing or not connectivity in South Asia. So Who would like to go first? Maybe we should ask Mr. Lodi first, and then ask Mr. Menon and Mr. Tariq. Mr. Lodi, since there was a direct question about the US-Pakistan military alliance.
Well, as I mentioned in passing, but it's an important point that during the Cold War, and I don't want to, dwell on history so much, but just because somebody's asked this question, Pakistan saw a dominant neighbor, and part of its external balancing strategy was to enlist the United States in its support. Now that suited the United States at that time, of course, because of the Cold War. And therefore, Pakistan's relationship with the United States helped Pakistan modernize its military and, of course, equip its military. That's a fact. Happened during the 60s, 70s. And of course, later the two countries were to disagree on Pakistan's nuclear capacity and its quest to get a nuclear capacity in response to India's nuclear test. So, you had, there are lots of complexities that were, of course, injected into the region. But this is life. I think this is what happens everywhere in the world. I don't think our region is unique. The Cold War impacted the whole world. And now the Sino-US sort of standoff or confrontation, whatever you want to call it, is also impacting the world. So we now see Pakistan much more closely aligned with China, if there's any such thing, because previously it was aligned more militarily and strategically. Now it is aligned more economically because of connectivity that is being introduced by the BRI project. But at the same time, we see India, and I don't want to speak on behalf of India because I think Ambassador Menon will do that. But from Pakistan's perspective, of course, it sees India as part of Quad. It sees India as part of American strategy of containing China. Now, we don't think that India will ever sign up to a strategy of hostilities with China. I mean, we don't see that, but we do see India leveraging America's need to counter China's rising global power. So, these four-way alignments, if I can call them that, are going to also impact on our region. So the challenge for Pakistan and India would be, how do you deconflict from some of this and carry on with a relationship which has its own dynamics? It's not easy. I mean, that's easier said than done. So I think, I would just simply say at a very simple level, we have to live with global big power dynamics. That's a fact of life. The question is, how do we navigate through these while trying to preserve a degree of stability in the Pakistan-India relationship? And I think right now, the focus by both countries, if I may say so, is really managing tensions, just ensuring that tensions don't get out of hand. And that itself, I think it's a very important, thing to do, given the history of the two countries and the fact that the two countries are nuclear powers. So, we simply cannot afford to have tensions spin out of control. And there have been recent incidents where they could have spun out of control. So I think, I would say the world doesn't give India and Pakistan enough credit as nuclear powers of managing their relationship in a responsible way as nuclear powers. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Menon?
I'll make 3 quick points because in a strange way, I actually think that India-Pakistan relations have been stabilized by the nuclear factor once we both went overtly nuclear. And I do think that, I don't think we should underestimate our capacity to actually manage this relationship. But anyway, about 3 geopolitical points. During the Cold War, the primary fault line was in Europe. South Asia was a sideshow. And frankly, given our economic condition at that time, we weren't very attractive as markets. We were, yes, they used us in the Cold War, but we were never central to it, the way Korea, Indochina, Europe were. today, the center of geopolitical contention is between, I mean, the central balance is really between China and the US, and the center of global economic gravity, center of political geopolitics is in the Asia Pacific. So whether we like it or not, we are going to be subject to much more great power interest because we are now close to where it's all happening, whether we like it or not. So it's a fact of life, as Ambassador Lodi said, and we might as well get used to it. Secondly, it has its uses. I mean, you know, it adds to our leverage in dealing with these great powers. If we are clear what we want to do, and if we don't allow them to manipulate us, but instead use the occasion, I don't see why we should not look at ASEAN countries. They're managing to balance, hedge, and bandwagon all at the same time without choosing between them. I mean, I find that quite admirable. And frankly, it seems to work well for their economies and for their security also. And I don't underestimate South Asia's capacity to do something similar, slightly different because of the nature of what we're doing. But the third point I want to make is that because we have, in a sense, been a sideshow for so long, many of us have got very involved in our domestic politics. And we've allowed our domestic politics to actually blind us to the opportunities that exist around us. And for me, the main factor which today prevents us from reconnecting South Asia is actually domestic politics in all our countries. I don't think our politics, domestic politics, can bear the weight of actually doing the things that we need to do, that we all agree that we need to do. And this is not one country or the other. I'm not here saying one country is worse, better, because, you know, we all have our moments, but that worries me. So we're 75 years old now, you know. We're too old now to go around blaming other people.
Ambassador Tariq, your views, please.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of thoughts to what has already been said, and both have made points which I think are very, very valid. What I'd like to say is that we were the third entity which emerged from the earlier two. In fact, I've always said that perhaps the Cold War basically midwifed our birth. And in a sense, the politics that emerged after the liberation of Bangladesh and its emergence as an independent sovereign nation, it also, unfortunately, wet-nursed its early politics, remnants of which still continue. However, I think the challenge in 1971 or 72 was, we have got our state. How will we enable the state to survive? That was the foremost thought, I think, in the minds of the founding father of Bangladesh. And so the foreign policy principles that he enunciated, when I look back, I think it's basically enabled us to survive the great power rivalries, the tensions, the standoffs that continued happening. They have not ceased. They are happening today in a slightly different context with slightly different protagonists and antagonists, still kaleidoscopically rearranging the relationship. We were landlocked, India landlocked. We were India locked. Number two, we had India as our immediate neighbor, and the rising power China as a close neighbor, one stage removed. We had the two worlds pitted against each other in the early 70s. And I think the fundamental principle of the foreign policy that we adhered to was friendship to all and malice to none. We had to steer a clear path between these two colliding rocks. Of late, then to some extent and of late, I have said that Bangladesh is like a very brittle walnut in the jaws of two nutcrackers. One is the regional war, that is India and China playing off now and their contestations and competitions and differences. The other is the global one. It's the previous configuration has been replaced by the Indo-Pacific on the one side and the BRI. And we have publicly said that we are with both. We are not against either. We have the Western powers and others very actively engaged in our projects within the country. We have India engaged in our projects in the country. We also have China engaged in major infrastructure projects in the country. All of them, in our perception, helps us to strengthen our role as a bridging nation, bringing countries together. So we don't talk of non-alignment anymore because it's politically unfashionable. Perhaps without stating it loud, what we are practicing is active neutrality. We will be friends with all. If we have two friends who's fighting with each other, we don't want to get wedged into that because we will be crushed. And that will continue to be. Number two, the domestic and, we have to psychologically, I come back to this point that how do we think, what frames us? We have separated 75 years of separatedness as sovereign independent nation states in the Westphalian sense. However, we forget that we have several millennia of being together. That is also embedded in our genes, in our political or socio-political genes that we inherit. Nothing is actually internal to any of us. What happens in our neighbors across the borders affects us psychologically and emotionally. That, most importantly, feeds into our political process. So there is a constant interaction. Nobody can say that, these borders, these hard Westphalian borders, exclude one from the other. And so it is necessary for our leaderships across border to be more empathic to the people, not just the leaders, but the peoples and the way they think. And what happens around us or near us or even a little further away does affect the way we behave. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tariq. I'm going to change tack from geopolitics and great power involvement to climate change, because there have been a couple of questions, because this is now a common problem. And this is a problem that stretches across the entire subcontinent. So would this be a factor that could bring the countries together? Because if the threat is a common one, and then there could be basis for greater cooperation, international cooperation, inter-state cooperation. So maybe I'll ask Ambassador Tariq to start, and then I'll invite the other two panelists to come on board. Ambassador Tariq?
Yes, thank you. I think you've touched on something which affects the very survivability of Bangladesh. We are among the frontline states which have been identified as being threatened by the effects of climate change. Now, climate change is the overall universal phenomenon which is affecting all of us everywhere in the world in greater or lesser measure. But we are threatened because, according to IPCC predictions made a couple of decades ago, if our coastline may change before we reach 2030. We've already lost large areas of the coastline. We are the most densely populated country in the world, according to international statistics. And as I mentioned in my earlier remarks in the beginning, we are a nation which are heavily dominated by what happens to our waterscape. Not just the rivers, but what happens to the ocean, the bay waters that wash against us. We have the Sundarbans, which in my own projections done in my center, unless we address some of the problems being faced by it, the Sundarbans may disappear before the end of the century, because they were mangrove forests that dotted all the littoral countries on the Bay of Bengal. Most of them have disappeared. We need to understand why that has happened. If our mangrove forests disappear, as one diplomat remarked to me, then our coastline will change drastically. What happens to the dense population inhabiting there, depending on its survival? This is something which we need all of us to work together. Particularly, we need to work with our immediate neighbors. We have recently, I think just less than a year ago, announced our Delta Plan 2100. This is how do we conserve and protect and develop the Delta without harming the ecosystem. But our Delta Plan is very much dependent on the flow of waters from the upper riparians to us. We need to arrive at a basin-wide water management solution. Water sharing is not the solution, because when you go into the conversation of sharing, it is basically a division of the spoils. And I have argued with friends and in public fora earlier that the partition's most egregious effect was perhaps on the ecology. We partition the ecology, the ecospaces that follow their own laws. They do not respect the laws of man. India has its own water problems in southern India because they have not been, despite commissions being there, Supreme Court rulings being there, presidential intervention being there, they have not been able to resolve the southern, because the states own the water. Waters cannot be owned by any entity or state. It is common. The problem which we did not have earlier was that we were managing these waters without realizing we were, because we were part of one integrated ecosystem. We have to revert back to that. And the more it remains unaddressed, the more tensions it will progressively create.
Thank you, Mr. Tariq. Mr. Lodi?
I'll keep my response short because I think we're nearing the close, and I'm sure there are a couple of more people who would like to ask questions. I would say simply this, that climate change is a real and present danger to all the countries of South Asia. For Pakistan, the very fact that we've had very heavy early monsoons and flooding in parts of Pakistan today just underlines the kind of danger that climate change poses. Our glaciers are melting, there's desertification going on. So, you know, very, very paradoxical things are happening, but they're all a consequence of climate change. Now, one of the responses that Pakistan has come up with, which is a national response, is to seek a nature-based solution by planting more trees. And that has been associated with the former Prime Minister Imran Khan, who launched the billion tree plantation campaign, which was hugely successful and of course acknowledged by the United Nations and the international community. So yes, I think the space for cooperation in this area is enormous. But again, you know, I mean, we know what stands in the way. But one point I would make, not just confined to climate change, but more generally to the state of relations between our countries. You know, it's interesting that in multilateral forums, since I served at the United Nations, it's amazing how we are able to cooperate, because the shared challenges are so real that we do cooperate. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, I mean, all the countries of South Asia. I mean, we're part of certain negotiating blocs. The group of 77 in China, for example, on development issues, we negotiate together. We're also part of the same group, the Asia Pacific group, on whether, you know, who we need to support in elections to key UN bodies. That doesn't mean that we don't compete with each other, but let's say we compete in a very civilized way, in a negotiated way. So I don't know. I mean, I just want to throw that up. Here are two countries which are usually at loggerheads in the subcontinent, but they're quite happily cooperating with each other on global issues, and of course, issues that affect both countries. So something has to be said about the fact that shared challenges do drive the two countries, even though they need multilateral forums to express that cooperation. So I'll end there. And I think climate change is one of the issues on which we have negotiated together.
Thank you, Ambassador Lodi. Ambassador Menon, your thoughts?
I can be very brief. I agree with what both of them have said before me. This is certainly an area where we can work together. This is also, I think, now so critical that, I hope we get past the theater of politics and actually deal with the issues. I mean, Lahore and Delhi have the same air problems every winter, that haze, the inversion. 250 million Indians live on the coast and will be affected by any rise in sea level. So, I mean, we're talking huge numbers, a common problem. It's obvious this is something that we should do, must do. And yes, there's tremendous opportunity here.
Okay, I think we are running out of time. So I'm going to pose one last question to the panelists. And this one, in a way, combines a few questions that I've seen on the chat box. And this is a look to the future. So we're talking about the young people of South Asia, the youth of South Asia. Now, India, Pakistan celebrating 75th anniversary. So partition has now moved from living memory to history. And do you see a change coming over the younger generations of South Asians as they look to the future and say that, okay, all this past history, the Cold War and what have you, that's a matter of the past. And this will have an impact on domestic politics, which had been discussed. And that could bring about a change in inter-regional connectivity. So may I have your thoughts? So the youth, a shift, a move away from the past and the kinds of constraints of the past, and then to a future where common problems like climate change and others may just drive, I think, the people, the next generation of leaders of South Asia to feel the impulse of needing to work together more closely. Maybe I'll invite Ambassador Menon and we'll go that way. Ambassador Menon, your thoughts?
Well, I can only tell you anecdotally, I teach in university. And I find the younger generation has a completely different attitude. Of course, they listen to the same music as their Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Sri Lankan colleagues. I mean, it's the same cohort. But they don't look at the future the way the generation who was scarred by partition does. And they don't even know the history particularly. Where it becomes complicated is where they don't draw a distinction between their domestic political agendas and what happens in the rest of South Asia. And I think, so to an extent, they've already internalized the results of partition. They look beyond it. And they talk of issues, as you said, like climate change. They talk of other issues. They think it's complete incompetence on the part of their elders. They think anybody over the age of 30 anyway is stupid. But that it's complete incompetence that SARC doesn't work, that they haven't settled these issues so far. They have very little patience for this. But they have a slightly different, more transactional view of these things, I think, than earlier generations who brought all kinds of emotions, and both positive and negative, to these relationships. So where they'll take it, I don't know. But certainly it's going to be very different. The next 20 years are not going to be like the last 20, or certainly the next 75 going to be very different. I don't believe that this is a case where history will repeat itself.
Mr. Lodi?
I think I can also say that in Pakistan, the younger generation is more forward-looking. It is less burdened by the past. And therefore, it can think in new ways about the future. But they also come up against politics because they don't run their countries, not yet anyway. The question is whether this cohort, when it does become part of the ruling elite, if it wants to, would they then act differently? We don't know, because so far we've seen that the post-independence generation, also continued the kind of policies in both countries that the independence generation, if I could put it that way, had pursued. So I think, as I said in my presentation, we need a new narrative, and we need the young to lead with this new narrative, which talks about the need for conflict resolution and for rising above narrow national interests to look at the collective interests of this region. And I think, lastly, I would say on a lighter note, since Ambassador Menon also talked about music. You know, the younger generation is very connected. No longer can governments in South Asia prevent, as they used to in the earlier decades, because technology just makes it possible. I mean, I can speak to anybody I wish to, and I often do speak to Indian journalists to, you know, get a better understanding. Now, it would have been hard for me to do this, 25, I don't want to give away my age right now, but it would have been hard. And I think, you know, there is people-to-people connectivity of this interesting kind in the entertainment sphere. I mean, many Indians that I know love Pakistani music, and Pakistanis, of course, love Bollywood. And again, Indian families are just tuned on to Pakistani dramas. So it's very interesting. Now, if, you know, these methods or these mechanisms can also be used not to reinforce hostilities, because sometimes these movies and these dramas also reinforce, the view of the other, which is not a very positive view. If these can also be used to project more positive images of the other, then you look at your neighbor as a neighbor, but not as an enemy, but as a neighbor with whom you have major problems, but you need to resolve these problems. So I'll end there. I like to be optimistic too. You know, sometimes it's difficult, but I do want to be optimistic.
Thank you. And Mr. Tariq, we'll let you have the last word on this.
Well, very briefly, I agree with both the points of views, and generally I find a commonality between both Shankar and Malia. I'll say the same thing. We are 2.5 generations from our own independence. 2.5 generations, the thinking has changed. And today, I'm also nested in a university, although I don't teach them directly. I do interact with students. They look to the future. They look ahead of them. They're not interested in the past, or increasingly not interested in the past. So I think that is the vote bank that everyone has to cater to and try and develop. Because ultimately, over here in this part of the world, Bengal was always politically hyperactive, way ahead of others in thinking of ideas. We continue to be extremely politicized in our discourses and debates. I find even my driver, who perhaps has not gone beyond the 6th or 7th grade, but reading the newspapers assiduously and commenting. This is where policies and actions translate into the domestic and internal politics. They have access to information of what is going on in India, what is going on east of us, and in the larger world. So in that sense, the second thing that basically dominates our thinking over here is where I mentioned that we are India locked. The hugeness of India around us does weigh on many. So what happens inside India does also affect how people look at relationship with neighbors. And therefore, I mentioned this, that we have to have greater empathy for each other and try and figure out what is it that we can do to keep promoting togetherness and not deepening the divide and broadening the chasm. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Tariq. It's a lovely note to end this wonderful discussion. I'm afraid we have run out of time and I have to bring this session to a close, but we've heard 3 excellent presentations and we have had very good questions. And I am grateful to the panelists for sharing your insights, your thoughts, and also answering the questions. I hope all our audiences have had a great time listening to these 3 speakers. And also, I hope that we've answered all your questions. I know there are 1 or 2 that we have not had time to cover, but there are a few more roundtables in the following days. So I'm sure you'll have a chance to ask our future speakers in the next few days if you have questions about connectivity and the region. So on behalf of ICES, I would like to thank our panelists again and to all of you for participating in this afternoon's roundtable, and would like to invite you to join us in the next few days. Winifred, do I hand this over to you now to close the session?
Yes, thank you, Prof. Dan. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to thank all the speakers and the chairpersons for such an insightful discussion and the participants in attendance today. Please do not forget to join us over the next few days for 6 exciting roundtable sessions under the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.